Hi, my name is Karl Barnfield, and I pastor the Eternity Baptist Church. And the other day I Googled myself because I'm not a computer person. And I guess all I do is funerals. I just put my name in to look at who I am, and the only thing it said about me was he did this funeral, and he did that funeral, and he did that funeral. So I guess if somebody in the world was saying, I want to find out about old Karl Barnfield, I wonder what he's doing, I wonder what his story is. So being the pastor, um, I have a strange start, and I'm 66 years old. So when I was a kid, to come from a situation in a normal Southern Illinois family, when I went to school, I went to a class of about 16 at Thompsonville. I think I was the only person in the room whose parents were divorced. The other people, that wasn't, people didn't do that all the time. In my family, I was the only one whose parents were divorced. My mom's sisters were both married to the same man they had been, and my uncle was married to the same woman he'd been married to. So when I'd get together with the cousins, I was the oddball. So that story started off kind of strange because my parents got married, and my grandpa didn't like my dad. And my grandpa was not exactly a perfect guy, and my dad was a lot worse. And his youngest daughter married him anyhow. And they had me. And then through whatever happened, my dad decided that he didn't want to be with my mom. He wanted to be with my mom and another woman, and my mom wasn't open to that, and she was young when she had me. And so my dad left, and my grandma went back to her mom and dad's house and took me with her. And she and her dad didn't get along great. And for whatever reason, she decided to move to Chicago when I was 3 years old. So I didn't see her when I was three till I was five. And my grandpa got the job of raising me. He thought he's raised his own children, they ought to raise their own children, and he didn't really like being tasked with the responsibility. My grandmother's a very kind woman, so she filled in as everybody for me. She's my mom, she's my dad, she's everybody. So you grow up with that twisted self-worth. What did I do wrong? So if there's any kids watch this, you live in a culture now where maybe the majority have strange families, not with their dad, not with their mom, being raised by an aunt or uncle or a neighbor or your grandma. And that's the way it goes now. But when I was growing up, that was odd. So uh, because of being beat down and yelled at and being sort of depressed, the depressing situation, I turned to humor. Thought I was real funny. Some people thought I was funny. So I would have thought for years that I was an extrovert and that I was really out there. But now people have told me in the last 3 or 4 years, you're an introvert. And my wife and another lady from church were talking. They said, "Oh yeah, he's an introvert." So who am I? Who are you? People all know you. They can all summarize you. I met a lot of people in high school. Met a lot of people in college. Been a lot of things. Been perceived as a lot of things. Uh, Perceived as soft. Perceived as hard. Perceived as funny. Perceived as grumpy. Uh, all over the place, like all of you. So if I was trying to describe myself, I don't know what I am. On my high moments, I want to be an entertainer. I love applause. I like a room full of people. I liked singing and entertaining and doing stuff and everybody having a big time and laughing and going crazy. And I enjoyed that. But then there's the part where I want to go sit by a fire by myself, keep adding wood to it, and just sit and think. I don't like to be in front of people all the time, and I don't like to be by myself all the time. So I guess I'm messed up. Now, on the spiritual stuff, I wasn't raised in church. My grandma was one of those ladies that could do something if grandpa said she could do it. She wasn't even allowed, she didn't have a driver's license. She didn't go anywhere without his permission. So she didn't get to go to church unless he said she could go to church. And so when I started living with them when I was 3, and they raised me, and I got took to church when I was 9. I went to vacation Bible school at a big Methodist church. And I remember being such an idiot. I didn't realize that you sing line 1, go down a stanza, keep singing line 1, go down a stanza, keep singing line 1. So my first church experience that I remember was me singing like an idiot, going straight down the page, and them having to stop me and say, that's not how this goes. And then I went to vacation Bible school at a Southern Baptist church that my grandmother attended when Grandpa had let her. And on the 4th night, on evangelism night, the pastor did his job. He did it well. But he talked about whether you want to go to heaven or go to hell. Well, I was no genius at 9 years old, but I sounded like going to heaven. And this Jesus stuff was a lot better than going to hell. But then we didn't go to church. Grandma wasn't allowed. Grandpa didn't want to. And so I began to learn that church must be for women and sissies. I didn't know who it was for. And I referred to my baptism. My grandfather, of all things, he and Grandma decided he was tight. They decided to drive me over to his aunt's house in another town to tell her that I was going to get baptized because I'd been saved. And I referred to it as getting dunked. And then embarrassed my grandma, and I got chewed on. Oh, Karl, don't say things like that about things like this. But I had no spiritual formation. Didn't learn anything. Learned from my grandma's big family Bible with pictures of Moses and pictures of other Bible characters, and that kind of stuck in my mind. Then, when I was 12 years old, this evangelist was preaching at this little country church out by where we lived, and he was preaching on the second coming a lot. And my grandpa found that interesting, and he started going to every night to the revival, and they took me. And I was 12 years old, and I'd begun to horse around a little bit, be a little bit evil, wanting to participate in more bad. And that evangelist scared me to death. And I remember those days after that, I went to the altar one night and said, I want to be saved. And I was intercepted by Baptist people who believed about once saved, always saved. And they said, oh no, you were saved when you were 9. And that was the end of that discussion, and still not in church. The revival ended and Grandpa ended about going to church. And once in a while we'd go, and some other old couple would pick up my grandma, and sometimes I'd go too, and didn't get a lot out of it. But every day when I'd cut across the fields, any day I was doing that, going over to neighbors' houses to play football or do something out in the country, seemed like there were more white puffy clouds that year than there'd ever been in the history of man. And I'd heard that Jesus was going to come back. And that preacher said he'd come back, and nobody knew when. No man knows the hour or the day. So I was afraid to go to hell. So at night, I would say, Dear Jesus, I know you're coming back tonight. And that way, I figured he couldn't come because nobody's supposed to know. And I could stall up God on coming back. I've got an embarrassing testimony. So I was baptized at 9 years old. And then at 12 years old, I wanted to get saved. And then I got in junior high. And I met up with the birds of a feather, and we had, some of them had older brothers and stuff, and they began to get us, by the time we 8th grade summer going into being a freshman, they were getting us wine. And we had to graduate. There's a system. You don't like the taste of beer the first time you taste it. I never met anybody that said, oh, that's yummy the first time they tasted it. The first cigarette tastes like crud. You have to acquire a taste for it. That's kind of weird that we work so hard to get around where we do that. I was beginning to do stuff like that and run around and drink, and was a good student, honor student. Got in high school, played 3 sports a year. I was the student body president at West Frankfort High School in 1976, my senior year. But I was getting drunk, 3 or 4 nights a week. And sitting at a doctor's office one day, I read a thing about if 7 of these things are true or 6 or whatever, you're an alcoholic. And I read that magazine, killing time waiting to go to the doctor. And I thought, do you drink alone? Yes. Do you drink when you're sad? Yes. And I thought, well, good grief, according to that magazine, I'm an alcoholic. But I didn't ever tell anybody, tried to hide it, didn't do anything about it, and didn't have any real problems with still everything I was doing. And so there you are. Baptized at 9, and then one night I came in about 3 shades in the wind to my grandparents' house. And we had no house in town, and you had to walk through their bedroom to get to where I slept. And I was out of high school. And let me back up into one more thing. A real pretty girl was interested in my soul. And that's all she was really interested in, really. But she invited me in high school to go to a youth thing where they were going to make the world's biggest banana split or something stupid in a trough. And I went because I'd have went to that or a bar or wherever she was going, I would have gone. So I went to the church thing, and that guy talked about Jesus come back, scared the snot out of me again. But I didn't do anything about it that night. I just couldn't wait till he shut up and got out. Then by the time I was out of high school, I came in that night that I just referred to drinking, and went through my grandparents' bedroom and laid down on the bed. And this is a kind of a charismatic sounding something for me, but I was laying there and I put one foot on the ground to keep the bed from spinning so you don't throw up. And I wasn't that drunk. And I felt like God threatened me. I felt like God said, I could use you or I can do without you. And it scared me. It scared me bad. I woke my grandparents up. And I said, I'm shook up and I'm crying. And I told them, I said, I've been drinking and running around and doing all kinds of things for a long time. And they said, yeah, we know, but you're like your dad, the dad they didn't like, their ex-son-in-law. We knew it wouldn't do any good to try to tell you anything, so we just had to wait for you to come to the end of it. And so I came to somewhat of an end of it. And I'd go to West Frankfort First Baptist once in a while with friends, but a lot of them, different kids I knew in high school, being popular and knowing all kinds of people, they did the same junk on Friday night that I was doing or Saturday that I was doing, and then they'd go to church. So I went there and thought that was a bunch of fake stuff. But I was going to be social in the extrovert mode. And had that experience So I called the pastor of the First Baptist Church that night that I got scared drinking. And he talked to me a little bit. And I called the preacher who was the preacher when I was 9 years old at the church I went to. I found his number and called him, and I told him what I had going on, and they were gracious and spoke to me a little while. And so I started going to church. And of course, everybody said, you know, you were saved when you were 9 years old. And I went with that. And had never lived for Jesus, didn't really know much about him, even thought about becoming Jewish. Didn't know anything about Judaism either, but I thought since Jesus was a Jew, maybe I ought to, study out and maybe become a Jewish or something. I dumb as a box of rocks. Had no idea about anything spiritual, really. Of all things, they go to a crusade, and I went with them to the crusade, and a whole bunch of the church was going, a whole bunch of the county went. An old evangelist named E.J. Daniels, and every night that he'd preach for the first 2 or 3 nights, it felt like he'd forgot about anybody else being there in that great big tent. Like he was just talking to me. So I went forward. And this time nobody said, you were saved when you were 9. And I asked the Lord to save me in the Southern Baptist way. Where you say this prayer, repeat these words, tell Jesus you're a sinner, and tell him you want him to be saved and you want him to come into your heart. And I did all that stuff, and I went home, and my grandma was a wonderful woman. I mean, my grandma was the person, if you said nobody in the world cares for me, my grandma, I couldn't say that about her, and she loved the Lord. But I went home after that crusade, and I told her, I said, I think I really got saved. And she said, oh, Karl. And she was about as embarrassed in some ways as she was when I told that old woman, my grandpa's aunt, that I was going to get dumped. I wasn't fitting the mold, So from that, I wound up being in the middle of church, doing things. They put me in children's church. We had a great big children's church. We ran 6 buses at the church I was going to back when they ran buses all over. There was an old woman named Hallie Nipper, and she was getting ready to retire from children's church, and they thought maybe I'd be good with those children, because Baptist churches were infamous. A lot of them that I knew of have taken some moron like me, who's gregarious and outgoing and been a leader in things and other areas of life. And so my first day in children's church, this bus kid, rough, vulgar, he called Miss Nipper. He said, shut up, you old fag. And I said, I walked over to him and I said, I'm going to tell you something. I took him off to the side. I said, if you knew what you just said, if you knew what you meant when you called that poor Miss Nipper a fag, I'd light you up. He said, it means she's an old queer. I said, bend over. So I gave him about 5 good whops. And so the preacher met with me after church that day when people told him what happened. And I was no longer a children's church worker because you can't spank other people's kids, especially at church, even back then. So that didn't work out for my ministry. And then I was sitting at church on a Wednesday night. And pretty much a bonehead, still not real serious about serving the Lord, getting kind of serious about church, and kind of a mixed bag of worldly and trying to be religious, trying to figure out what I was, what I wasn't. I had another one of those overwhelming experiences. I thought, I don't know what to do. And the church was big. And on Wednesday night, they didn't give an invitation or anything. The preacher just did a study. And I stood up in the back of that big room full of people when church was over, and I said, I got to say something. I'm about to bust. And the preacher spoke to me from all the way from the front and said, what is it? I said, I think God wants me to serve him full time. So I walked down there, and the preacher interviewed me. He was the one I'd called years earlier when I had the other scary experience. And he knew of me and, what all I was. But he said, well, do you think God wants you to do music? Because I did a lot of stupid stuff doing music. And I said, I don't know. And he said, do you think God wants you to work with youth? I guess as long as you didn't spank anybody. But anyhow, I said, I don't know. He said, well, do you think you should preach? I said, that sounds more like something. I don't know, maybe. So this is a church running 500 people on good days, maybe more sometimes even. It was really a big church. He was going to be gone the next Wednesday, and he said, you'll preach your next sermon next Wednesday night. I said, okay. Well, I knew how to make an inverted pyramid, to give a thesis statement with your 3 main points. And so I had 3 points and 3 passages and made up this hodgepodge thing of a sermon. And everybody came to see if the wild would-be church boy, what's the deal on this? Because people had speculated on how long I'd last when I started going to church. They thought I'd be too prone to be like my dad, or too prone to be ignorant, drunk, or stupid. So when I preached, there was a big turnout on that Wednesday night. And I went for it. And when I gave the invitation, just imitating what I'd seen them do about giving an invitation, I probably wasn't supposed to give an invitation on Wednesday, but I did. And the whole front of the altar, the whole thing, people were all over the place praying. So people were going, wow, there's something up. Somehow God's using this goofball Karl Barnfield. And I'm the guy who we went out to play church softball, and nobody told me. And I'm the guy who somebody came by and said, it'll really be a lot better if you don't have your jaw full of tobacco spitting all over the place while we're playing church softball, First time I played racquetball with a bunch of church guys, in the heat of the moment, I didn't know what all I'd said. And they were kind of cracking up while we were changing clothes, getting cleaned up to leave the racquetball court, because apparently every time I hindered, I was big and strong and knocking people around, and they call hinder, and I guess I sounded like Billy Sunday or somebody still talking. So I went through that whole thing. And so they told me I need to go to school. And I think if I'd been the preacher, I'd have said anything to get me to go somewhere else. Because I was full of myself. I thought I knew what church ought to do, what it ought not do. I got all the church leaders to meet with me one time of this big church, because I didn't think we were evangelistic enough. I thought since this deal about Jesus saving you was such a big deal, we ought to be out doing more than they were. Because you're an expert when you're full of yourself. And so I went to school. Long story. I won't tell all the starts and stops of that. Went to Liberty University with a full football scholarship and heard all the rules of Jerry Falwell. After a long bus ride to Virginia, I took another long bus ride back to Illinois, because I told one of the professors, and he kind of smiled and patted me on the shoulder and wished me well. I said, Jerry Falwell didn't save me. Jesus Christ saved me. And I don't care about all Jerry's rules. So I went to a Southern Baptist school in Texas. And I was still hit and miss. Pretty spiritual sometimes. Pretty not spiritual other times. And I wound up at a church. After I graduated, I wound up at a church. And then the church doubled in short order in size. But I had people not wanting the church to reach people. Nice people, good old boys, met with me and said if we wanted to go to First Baptist, we'd go to the First Baptist. We like it here at our little town Mount Church, where we all know each other. We don't want a great big church. And the fellow bought me an ice cream cone and called me big boy. You know, with all the glory that goes along with his respect for what a pastor was. You know, me being out there as a young guy. And I called the president of the school I went to in Texas. And I said, what do you do when your church doubles in size? And they don't like it. And he said, you come back down here and work for me. And I went back and worked at Howard Payne University, had married Christy in between there, while I was at that little First Country church and working. 6 weeks after we got married, I moved to Texas. Back to Texas for me, to Texas for her. But it wasn't preaching. You see, that no confidence thing, that everybody getting out of it. Your dad gets out of raising you, and your mom gets out of raising you, and your grandpa wished he'd never had to get in the business. And so I was great material for Satan or whoever wanted to work to make you feel unworthy. And I was also a controversial human being, real spiritual, real not spiritual. And lo and behold, after I wind up back in Illinois again from not working at the university and taking a church full time. And there's a preacher named Bailey Smith, and he had this sermon where he wanted to see a lot of church people get saved. And I thought, well, I had some cranky old deacons, and I got everybody go to the big rally, and I thought, good, maybe somebody will get saved. And I had my third scary moment. I froze. He said if you didn't dot every I and cross every T and do everything perfect, you weren't a Christian. And that sounded right to me. If you've got everything to do with getting saved, doing your contract right, saying the right words, whatever it was, I figured God got me on a technicality and he didn't want me either, really. And I had a freak out. I was trying to walk to the altar and fell to my face. I wasn't the only one. I think there were people that genuinely got saved that night. I didn't know what I was doing. I'm pastoring a church. Got a wife and a baby. I didn't know what God did to me. So after everybody left the big meeting, I was sitting on the steps of the church. And I was embarrassed. And I didn't know what I'd done. And I went and told Grandma. And I got a great grandma. But she said, oh, Karl. I've heard that a lot in my life. Old Karl. Usually it means, oh my gosh, I can't believe you've done this, Karl. Old Karl. And she was really embarrassed now. And so I had these knotheads in church, some mean old creeps, some of them. So that was on a Tuesday night. That happened to me at that Bible conference. And Wednesday, I went to church and I told him, I said, something happened to me last night. You've heard my long testimony, all the am I saved or not deals, and I don't know what he did. But if you got a preacher who doesn't know what happened to him, then maybe you don't need me as a preacher at all. I don't have my act together. And one of the crustiest ones of the crusties stood up. He said, you've been doing an awful good job if you weren't saved. It'd be kind of interesting to see what you'd do saved. And if you were saved and you're just struggling through stuff, I think you ought to just keep doing it. Now, this is a guy who periodically would go to a rummage sale or something somewhere and be talking to somebody and say, that preacher, because the church was growing. People were being saved. It was a church running about 40 with 700 members. And God had blessed, and it was running 150, 200, whatever. He said, don't you think it's about time for that preacher to leave? One day he was talking to a woman at a rummage sale, really, and he said, don't you think it's time for him to move on down the road? And she said, you do know that's my brother-in-law. And he goes, yeah, I don't care. Don't you think you ought to go? But that night when I didn't know what to do, God spoke whatever God said, allowed him to say something, and I stayed. Oh my goodness. I went on a tangent. I went on a tear of studying. I didn't know what I believed. I went to a Pentecostal preacher and I told him, I don't know what I did at that Bible conference. But if I got saved, then I'm no Baptist. And if I'm saved and don't even know it, I'm not much anything either. What can you tell me? He said, I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to tell you my story. He said, I got saved and called to preach all the same night, and I spoke in tongues. And he said, that's what God did in my life. And he said, now, I'm going to tell you what you need to do. Now, you're expecting me to tell you, if you grew up back in that era that I'm talking about, that he got me to say words so I would speak in tongues and do? No. This Pentecostal preacher at the Church of God said, you've won more people to the Lord than my whole church. Since I've heard of you, you've led more people to Christ and more people have been saved and baptized than my whole church. So what you need to do is go back and go about your business and be a Baptist preacher. That's what you need to do. Another unlikely, he could have got a notch in his gun belt and got the Baptist preacher to switch over to something else. Then, to make this story longer, I was trying to go get more theological education. And I went to Louisville, Kentucky, to Southern Seminary to make a visit and see if I could travel and back and forth and do seminary and keep my church. And by the draw, there's a man named Timothy George, who's one of the only few, if there are even more much, theologians who are Southern Baptist. He's at Beeson Divinity School, if he's not retired, at Sanford University now, but he was at Southern Seminary, and he got me. Just professors got stuck talking to prospective students. He asked me if I'd read this, and have you read that, and have you read this, and have you read that, and he had his PhD in theology from Harvard, and he said, Karl, you truly are unlearned. I had a bachelor's degree, but he said, you are truly unlearned. So I would read books, the ones he asked me if I'd read. And I'd drive to Louisville, Kentucky, and he graciously met with me 5 or 6 times to see if I had it right. And he wanted me to learn Calvinistic theology, Reformed theology. But he told me, if you have to be a flaming Arminian or a well-rounded Calvinist, if it means being an Arminian to keep your passion for souls, I'd rather see you not quite where you need to be theologically if you're going to lose your heart. But I read and read and bought and bought and bought and read, and wound up being who I am now. Looking back on over 40 years of being an ordained preacher. Ever since I've been ordained, I didn't do the drinking, carousing, nothing. Ill-tempered, hot-headed, a little bit mean, but no big revelations of why I'd have to be kicked out or anything.